Many Americans like to brag about how America is number one in a lot of things. For example, number one in strongest militaries in the world or number one in GDP. But a lot of these patriots seem to always ignore the more negative number ones. For example, America is number one in the highest prison population on Earth. You've all heard this statistic. The United States of America makes up 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. 2.3 million Americans are confined throughout the country. But how did it get to this point? To address this question, we must look back to the days of slavery and view this through a systemic lens. The abolition of slavery brought a temporary stop to the free labor provided by African Americans that the economy of the South depended so heavily on. Therefore, the abolition of slavery proved to be destructive to the economy of the South. The white political elite of the South eventually needed some type of way to access what they saw as a sort of untapped resource, cheap labor provided by African Americans. More recently, we see a doubtless second coming of slavery through forced prison labor. To this day, companies such as Victoria's Secret, Walmart, and Whole Foods utilize prison labor because of how cheap it is. According to AZ Central, the starting pay for jobs overseen by the Arizona Correctional Industries ranges from 10 cents to 23 cents an hour. This occurs because, according to Freedom United, the 13th Amendment shockingly permits slavery as a punishment for crime. African Americans were arrested for extremely minor crimes such as homelessness and loitering, and so came the first major wave of mass incarcerated Black people. This leads me to another major event that has led to the number of incarcerated people in America, the war on drugs. With this, millions of Black Americans were serving time for very low-level offenses such as possession of marijuana. We now know that the phrase law and order is a type of anti-Black dog whistle thanks to Nixon administration official John Ehrlichman, who had this to say about the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. With Reagan's presidency, we see a blatant target on the backs of Black people, with more strict punishments for possession of cocaine in the form of crack cocaine and less strict punishments when it came to the possession of powder cocaine. Powder cocaine was more expensive and used more in suburbs that were predominantly white, whereas crack cocaine was cheaper and was used in predominantly Black neighborhoods. There have also been ways for people of power to keep Black people in the prison system. For example, the 3 strikes you're out law imposed by Bill Clinton. The purpose of this law was to keep criminals off the street by convicting people for life after a violent offense if the person had already been previously convicted of 2 minor offenses. Although violent crimes include murder and kidnapping, the 3 strikes law also considers any defense punishable by 10 years in prison to count as a violent crime worth the punishment of the 3 strikes law. This seems like somewhat of a setup when you then consider mandatory sentencing, which did not even allow judges to consider the circumstances involving a crime. In the case of crack cocaine, 280 grams would land you 10 years in prison, which then would count as the violent crime for your 3 strikes. Some states imposed a truth in sentencing law that made sure to keep people in prison for at least 85% of their sentence, which according to the Michigan Department of Corrections, eliminates disciplinary credits, good time, and correction centers for certain offenders, and requires offenders to serve the entire minimum sentence in prison prior to being considered for parole. In addition to these laws put in place to keep people in prison, concepts such as cash bail also do the job by favoring the wealthy and leaving poor Americans stranded. It is one of the reasons why 74% of people being held by jails are not convicted of any crime. The vicious cycle of the prison system does not stop there. This type of discrimination and racism is systemic or institutionalized, meaning that it is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization, according to Wikipedia. We see systemic racism within mass incarceration through issues such as the over-policing of less wealthy Black neighborhoods. We must also consider how, once you become a convict, you are no longer eligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, and food stamps. I'm aware of how dark this subject is, but this is the reality of our prison system in America. I believe there is still hope, though. For advice on how to run our prison system better, we must look to other countries such as Norway, which favor a more rehabilitative approach to their prison system. But what we can do for now is vote and voice your support for politicians who will fight for prison reform.